Okay, welcome back. This will be the first installment in DasIst Maths Discusses or DasIst Maths Reacts. I haven't figured out if it's more of a reaction video or a discussion video just yet. But the purpose of this video was a few days ago, a friend of mine sent me an equation and he said, "Can you explain this?" And the first response was no, not without the hugely important context of what we're talking about. And so he explained to me what the equation was. I'll get to that in a minute. And then I realized that, well, yeah, I can kind of explain it. I can aim what it explains to do, but it seems like there are some political claims um, being made on both sides of the aisle as to what this thing actually does. So, to preface this, I just want to say that I don't want to confirm or, I guess, naysay anybody's political beliefs. So I'm going to be really, really careful here because I just want to talk about the mathematics of this. And I just want to talk about um, some of the economic principles that are going into this without getting political in any way. Most of these discussions, the political ones, are just trying to find some affirmation of what you already believe. I find that on both sides of the aisle here in the United States, there are very, very few people who watch any sort of political video who are willing to A, educate themselves, B, change their opinions on their already deeply seated beliefs. So, because that's counterproductive, I'm not going to be making any political claims here. Just going to be talking about what the equation says, what my impression of it is, and some of the points in the economics discussions that we're seeing here in the United States that I think a fair portion of the people who are the loudest voices in this conversation either don't talk about or don't understand, and that is nonpartisan. I see it from both sides. We have people on the far right saying things that are untrue. We have people on the far left saying things that are untrue, and both of them are guilty of blowing things way, way, way out of proportion. So I think that this will just be kind of an off the cuff video. But I have some talking points that I think are uh, reasonably good for anybody who's in, say, business education or business management, investment, finance, mathematics, anything like that. And it's always the goal here on this channel to educate people. And so stick around. I'll talk about this. If it's enlightening, that's great. Like it. If you don't like it, all right, whatever. I'm sure somebody else will be able to explain this maybe better than I can, or maybe you just like them better. I don't know. Um, so, what is this thing that was sent to me? Well, the thing that was sent to me is this equation. Let me clean up my board here. As much as I wish this was a video over Euler's identity, it's just not. So we were sent this expression, and I'm gonna try really hard to write it the correct way here. And that's the equation. Um, First things first, what the heck is this? The stated purpose of this was to calculate the reciprocal tariff necessary with a bunch of different trade partners for the United States, including things like trade barriers and currencies, that sort of thing. I'll move this down because my face is out of screen and I'm just lazy, and this is not intended to be edited heavily. So that was the stated purpose behind this thing. My initial reaction to this was kind of a what in the world is this? because it doesn't appear that any of the terms stated as what they're said to be actually do that. Now, what I'm sure there's a way that this is applied in economics. I'm sure there will be a textbook on it at some point. And I just want to go out here and say that I am a mathematician, not an economist. So I may have some things horribly, horribly wrong here, but I just wanted to talk about the mathematics of the topic. The first thing that I notice is that the numerator term here, this x sub I, m sub I business, and I guess the best way to do this would just be to define what these terms actually are supposed to be before talking about why I think any of the things that I think. Um, x sub I is defined to be the exports, and I'm assuming that these are total exports to another country. And then the I is an indice that indicates which particular country we're talking about. So if we wanted to go through like a spreadsheet where um, something like Australia, which starts with an A, is listed first, then the index one would represent Australia. And so X would be the exports to Australia. M, on the other hand, is imports to that country. And then we have these two other terms that we see in the denominator here. That's epsilon and phi, sometimes pronounced phi, just depends on who taught you your Greek, and I'm sure one of those is correct. But epsilon is the elasticity. Make sure I don't spell this wrong. Elasticity. And phi is what we call the price pass-through rate. Okay, so the elasticity is like the price elasticity that we talk about in, say, like a business calculus course or just a general macroeconomics, microeconomics type of course that most people take in their freshman year. So this is all based off of some data that I did not do the work to confirm, um, and so I'm just going to kind of take their word for it. And I think time will tell if these estimates are correct or not. And the phi is also a price pass-through rate, which is what percentage or what is the expected change that the consumer will see based on the tariffs that are imposed. So if you have a price pass-through of about 25%, then it's roughly a fourth of whatever the tariff is what the prices are expected to increase. Now, interestingly enough, I had to do some digging on this because that seemed like it came out of an economics textbook. I have no idea how they derived this thing. But there's a couple of really interesting points in this. First of all, the numerator term, the x sub I minus m sub I, is like the exports minus the imports. And that's really interesting to me because the way that this is typically taught in the economics courses that I've taken is that trade deficit is a term that looks really, really similar to this. So, like that thing on top, if you set that equal to a symbol that meant trade deficit, that's actually what that is. The only weird thing is that typically trade deficit is defined to be the imports minus the exports, not the other way around. But I guess that doesn't really matter because what will happen in this is the exports minus the imports, the reverse of that, will just make a negative when the normal trade deficit would be positive, and it will make a positive when the normal trade deficit would be negative. So inverting the terms, I'm not sure that changes the final number all that much. It does change the sign, which I think is awfully important. Um, but it doesn't appear that it's going to change anything about the actual value that the formula produces. Well, and I guess one other thing I could talk about here is what the heck is that delta tau? So the tau symbol is supposed to be the tariffs, and the way that I understand this is this has been taken to mean reciprocal tariffs, and the delta is just a difference operator from discrete mathematics that means the change in. So the change in the tariffs for each country is going to be defined by this particular formula. And then what it is it's the trade deficit divided by the elasticity of demand, the price pass through, and then the imports. However, if you note the way that this is being applied, and this took a little bit of digging, but it's actually in the page where this formula was originally stated. The epsilon and the phi term actually cancel each other out because of the estimated values for the elasticity of demand and the price pass through. So it's estimated that the elasticity is about 4, and it's estimated that the price pass through is about 0.25. In other words, that whole term there, epsilon times phi, is just 1. So what this thing really is the trade deficit divided by the total imports. So it's the ratio of the deficit to the um, trade imports, and that's supposed to compute as a percentage the tariffs that should be applied to the other countries um, as a matter of foreign policy. And that's really interesting to me. Couple of thoughts as I was reading through this. Um, I don't think that's actually what this does. I really don't. I don't think. I think that's a false equivalence. I don't think that the change in the tariff um, is necessarily what we have to charge. I guess that ratio would give you as a percentage the amount of difference as a matter of percentage um, in tariff that you would need to apply to the country in question in order to bring the trade deficit, trade surplus back into balance. Now, the interesting thing there, and one of the ways that I think this equation is actually kind of interesting, um, the the equation itself would suggest that if we operate on a trade surplus with a country, in other words, they buy more from us than we buy from them, then we would actually need, in order to bring that back into balance, and the way that I read this is very like Economics 101 textbook, which is that a trade surplus from our perspective would mean that a foreign country buys more from us than we do from them. A trade deficit would be the opposite of that. We buy more from that country than they buy from us. And a trade balance would mean that the net difference is, well, zero. Couple of things here. Now, this was said to account for things like trade barriers and currencies. I'm not entirely sure how they do that. I'm sure that what they do is they calculate something from the massive lists of trade data that they have, and then they apply that in the imports and exports terms so that they're not like really representing the amount of goods that are being exchanged between countries. Rather, it's an adjusted number that takes into account things like the trade barriers and the differences in the currency and all these other factors. But I can't find any information on how that was done exactly. So I'm sure that those numbers represent something like the total exports and something like the total imports, but in a more traditional economics sort of sense, the exports and imports refer, I believe, specifically to goods. I could be wrong on that. Maybe it accounts for services as well. But the way that I understood it was that those types of terms for trade deficit were specifically about goods being exchanged between countries. And I find that this is kind of the first really interesting talking point where I hear people going off on this kind of thing. And what has been bothering me is that I feel that an awful lot of folks, this is completely my opinion, but an awful lot of folks really do not understand the mathematics behind what is being said here. I think what this formula does is it does tell you what rate would need to be applied on another country to bring the deficit or surplus back into balance, which would be net zero. I know that from what I have heard, the way that this has been applied is that they are only using this in the case of a trade deficit, and everybody else is getting, I believe it's something like a flat 10%. So I think that's the way that this is actually being applied. Although the mathematics of this would seem to imply that we would need to impose, I guess, a negative tariff. We would need to artificially make goods from countries with which we operate a trade surplus cheaper in order to bring the trade surplus slash deficit back into balance. At least that's my interpretation of it. Um, let's see. The the other thing here that I think is really, really important to talk about is that I don't see how this formula takes into account the context. And in an earlier section of the video, I mentioned that the hugely important context, those words were chosen deliberately. They were chosen deliberately because I think that's the one thing that is being missed by quite a few people here. I think that we look at stuff like this and then we find somebody somewhere who will say, "Oh, that's perfect. That does exactly what they want it to do." Or we find people who say things like, "Oh, that's horrible, bad maths, whatever." And granted, this is like an off the cuff for me, so I'm sure that if I did some more reading, I could agree on whether or not it's good mathematics or not. I just don't think that this does what they say that it does, and that's really interesting to me. And I really think that the point that we've failed at, I guess the part of this that is being ignored is the context of the trade surplus or trade deficit. And that's actually a pretty good segue into my next talking point. So, in the idea of a trade deficit, I think that we've been conditioned to think in a way where deficit means bad and surplus means good. And I just don't think that this is the case. And I actually can't find any reading anywhere that says that this is the case either. In fact, I think that a trade deficit is in some cases very bad, obviously, but there's something else going on here that is proportionate to the trade deficit that I think nobody is talking about, and I think it's worth explaining that here. Not because I'm just an expert on this topic, but I think it's worth some additional reading, and I challenge you to go find some information about this um, to form your own opinion of it. So I think that an awful lot of people have been conditioned in this way to think that deficit means bad and surplus means good. And I think they're conflating the concept of national debt with trade deficits. A trade deficit doesn't necessarily mean that the United States is losing money. It means that the foreigners are sending the United States more than the United States is sending them. And I think what's really interesting about that is that if you dig just a teeny bit deeper, you can see that foreign investments are something that is also considered as a matter of national economic policy. And I don't think that this formula is accounting for this. And I really don't think that people who are thinking about this, at least let me be really careful here. The loudest voices are not either thinking about this or they are thinking about it and then they're intentionally hiding it because they have an agenda to push or whatever. It doesn't appear that the people who are presenting this information through media outlets and heck, even some of the YouTubers that I've seen, they don't talk about this kind of thing. And I think it's hugely important because just talking about this tariff formula and saying, "My God, this is so bad," and X, Y, and Z. Um, again, I don't think that this does what they say that it does. Number one, uh, but but I think that we're also missing a pretty key element, which is foreign investment. And I think that one of the one of the things, at least that I was taught, was that a trade deficit is such that it can really only arise if there's more investments coming into the U.S. Um, than outbound investments. In other words, US businesses and individuals choose to invest in US businesses and individuals, and foreign individuals also choose to invest in US businesses and individuals. And so I think that's really interesting because a deficit is really only possible in the case where the amount of investments coming in to the United States um, is at least proportionate to the trade deficit. And that's just because any foreign investments coming in will sometimes manifest themselves or be accounted for in the import terms of this equation. But the fact that United States citizens are choosing to invest in other US companies, which I'm sure you've heard somebody somewhere pushing in your town or community, invest in American businesses, support small businesses. We won't have them if all the big box stores or the multinational conglomerates take over. And I think that that's a really really key bit of context for this. So the way that we would write something like that in mathematics would be, and I'll just make up some terms here, that a deficit, a trade deficit, is proportionate. I'm going to try to do this symbol justice to the investments incoming to the United States. In other words, it is directly proportionate to an investment surplus. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily equally sized, but I am sure of the fact that it is proportionate. I'm not sure of the fact if it is equally sized or not. That would seem a little simplistic considering that the imports also account for things like goods, and so it could just be purchases made from other countries. For example, the United States buys a lot of Chinese goods. Um, so I don't know that the investment surplus is necessarily equal to the trade deficit in size, but I do know that it is proportionate. And I think that that's one example of how this conditioning that people have to think about deficits as a bad thing is, well, bad. Because a deficit really can only arise if there's an investment surplus, number one, which indicates that what is happening is we're issuing foreigners dollars, bonds, stocks in American corporations, um, in exchange for goods and services, more so than the other way around, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It means that we have foreign money coming into American businesses. And that can take the form of jobs, that can take the form of higher salaries for people in working class, that can take the form of all sorts of different benefits, just to name a few. And so I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, which is another reason why this is so interesting to me, because I'm not convinced that it does what they say that it does. And I'm also not convinced that the trade deficits are necessarily a bad thing. Like I'm sure that there are some bad deals in between some countries. I mean, like there's definitely self-serving attitudes on like every side of the spectrum, and so people are always trying to screw people out of money in one way, form, or fashion. And like, how better to do that than to screw some foreign country over so that it doesn't affect your own people? Um, but I think that the core point here is that this business of confusing a trade deficit and a trade surplus with deficit being bad and surplus being good um, is actually not entirely correct, and I think it's really damaging. I think the core of the issue with that kind of thinking is that it conflates the idea of a trade deficit with the actual national debt. And I think that you see deficit and you think, oh my God, we're in debt such and such amount to some odd country because like, oh well, we have this trade deficit with them, and I don't. That's not what that is. The trade deficit is just an imbalance between the exports and the imports, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we're losing money to that country. Now, the national debt, on the other hand, is a particularly important topic, but I don't think that this type of thinking is good because I think it increases the tendency of people who don't study this, especially people who don't study this or they don't have the tools with which to make critical decisions about this kind of thing. For example, I'm not an economist. I don't know the ins and outs of this. I'll freely admit it. I'm probably getting plenty of things wrong in this opinion video, but it's just my reaction and a discussion about it to bring up some of the points that I think are important. And I also think that because of what I do, I'm able to kind of look through this and think about what it actually says in a way that the average person maybe isn't necessarily able to do. And I think that there's an awful lot of people making decisions without this capacity. So I think it's very, very important to be clear that deficit bad, surplus good is a very destructive way of thinking. The deficit is not the national debt. Now, the figure for the United States national debt, incidentally, if you are interested, it is $36 trillion and counting currently. And I think that that actually kind of misses a lot of the point when people bring this up as the aha gotcha in any sort of debate here. And this is actually something that I want to see as a talking point, not completely disappear because it's incredibly important that the country is going bankrupt, but I want it to take kind of a backseat to some of the other economic issues here. And I think that we're seeing some of that, but where the United States national debt is concerned, it's that the federal spending is like $7 trillion at its current state, and the budget deficit is like $2 trillion or something or other like that, which means that we are spending more as a government than we are physically taking in revenues from the Internal Revenue Service. And that's a problem with taxation. Um, we have we have $5 trillion. I'm actually looking at the debt clock right now. That's what all that clicking was. $5 trillion of United States federal tax revenue right now, and the total state revenue is something like 2 trillion, 2.5 trillion, and the total local revenues is something like almost exactly 2 trillion, whereas the state debt is something like $1 trillion, and I believe that that is state debt to the federal government. I'm not entirely sure on that. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but the point is this: the way that that federal budget deficit is calculated is we take the federal spending minus the amount of revenue that the Internal Revenue Service generates every year, and that's the budget deficit. Well, there's this nifty little feature on the United States debt clock that lets you do the time machine, so to speak. In other words, you can look back at previous years. And so right now in 2025, the United States national debt's $36 trillion, and it's actually almost 37 trillion. You go back to 2020, and it's 26 trillion, with the United States federal tax revenue at something like $1 trillion, and the federal budget deficit was 2 trillion and some change. Go back a little bit further, 2016, the budget deficit on April 10th in 2016 was $500 billion. And that was the federal spending at $3 trillion and the federal tax revenue at 3 trillion. So it was a 3 trillion number closer to 4 trillion, and then a 3 trillion number almost exactly, which generates 500 billion of federal budget deficit. And then we go back maybe a little bit further, 2012, and we had a 15 trillion national debt with 3 trillion and a half in federal spending and a federal tax revenue of 2.5 trillion, give or take a little bit, $1 trillion deficit there. Um, and this is just, the thing I wanted to point out about this debt is it's just like a bank ledger or a credit card bill. If you operate a deficit for too long, then that national debt climbs. I'm sure that these figures are taking into account the I'm sure that these are taking into account things like interest paid to foreign banks and that kind of thing. It doesn't really break it down that far, and I don't care enough to look at it. But why I brought this up, there was a comment that I was reading somewhere, um, where after the Senate hearing, where they're trying to address the fact that there's a $1.2 trillion budget deficit right now, um, which incidentally is actually $2 trillion. Um, Somebody was commenting, wait, wasn't the federal budget deficit at one point like 8 point some odd trillion dollars? And if you look back at least at the historic every 4 years account of the national debt, it's really it's not the deficit itself is not that bad. It's that the national debt continues to climb because we have more data points, meaning more years, year after year, where we are operating at a budget deficit as opposed to operating at a budget surplus, and so the debt doesn't go down. So the other important topic here that I think kind of comes from that statement is the what this what this equation is angling to do. So I think that the spirit behind the equation is they want to address the national debt by handling, at least it seems to me, they want to address the national debt by handling some of the trade deficits that we operate with other countries. And their mechanism for doing this is to levy tariffs against those countries. Now, the thing I think is really interesting here. This is the counterintuitive part. This is where my economics completely fails me, incidentally. But the paradox here is that tariffs have long been regarded as an inflationary practice, and I think the main reason for that is actually right here. It's this price pass through term, which I believe is part of the reason why people will say that it's an inflationary concept, but it's not that it necessarily drives inflation. Um, I know that if the if the assertion is true that the inflation is a reflection of the stimulus to the economy in excess of the increase in production capacity, then what that basically says is that if we had a 2% production capacity growth every year, and then we had like a 9% money supply growth, then the inflation would be the difference of the two, 7%. And the difference with real inflation and tariffs is that real inflation is the result of year after year of tariffs increasing. The effect that appears to be inflationary, where prices go up with tariffs, is a very emotional one because it happens all at once. But I think that in order for it to sustain inflation, it would require that those tariffs go up year after year. It's not going to drive inflation necessarily just to have a tariff. Now, the other thing I'm not entirely sure on, and I'd like to hear some discussion about this, is I'm also not convinced that levying a tariff would it address the budget deficit? Well, according to the equation, it does, or at least this is what they're using to get the rate to that would bring the trade deficit back into balance, meaning net zero. So that may do what it says that it does. Remember, I'm not convinced that this does what they say that it does. But I guess in theory, if it does do that, and it does bring the deficit back into balance, then we'd be operating in a net zero with those countries. What I'm interested in is how would that affect the foreign investments? Remember that a deficit is proportionate, at least, although not necessarily equal in size, to the investment surplus that we operate with a country. So I'm interested, if we drive the deficit down, would that also drive down the foreign investments in the United States? And I worry that I don't think, again, not an economist, I don't think that that necessarily addresses the issue with national debt. I think the deal with national debt is, well, we have to drive spending down and increase revenue. That's probably an overly simplistic take on it, but I think that's the core of the issue. And I think that's something that a lot of people are kind of not talking about when we're discussing policies like this. I think the too long didn't read or skipped to the end of the video is this. This is the equation that they are saying will calculate the required reciprocal tariff with another country, based on the imports, the exports, and then the price elasticity and the price pass through. It is advertised to do this taking into account things like trade barriers and currency differences and other consideration, and I just don't think that it does that, because I also don't think that this is taking into account services from other countries either, unless there is some kind of method that we're in the dark about how the exports and imports amount were adjusted to account for the goods and services and foreign investments that are being put into the U.S. and going out of the U.S. Unless there's an adjustment for that, which I haven't seen, I'm not convinced that this does what they say that it does. What this is a ratio of the trade deficit, which is backwards, by the way. Like that is actually a thing. That is backwards. It should be the other way around. Divided by the imports, which in theory would give us the amount that we would have to charge in order to bring the trade deficit back into balance, but it would also give us an amount with surplus countries that we would need to make their goods artificially cheaper to bring that back into balance, which would be net zero. I don't think that this addresses national debt the way that people are saying on a lot of media outlets that it does. I don't think that it really adequately addresses the proportionality between the trade deficit and the investments coming in from other countries. And I think that it uncovers a really dangerous line of thinking, which is that deficit is bad and surplus is good for the reasons stated before. So I think it's important to educate yourself on these types of topics. Don't get scared away because it's a math equation. Um, Look into it, see what it does, see what it actually represents. And I think that this is really, really important. And a lot of people just ignore this, or they pick only the parts, cherry pick only the parts that they want to pick, instead of discussing the whole issue. And I think that the one thing that's missing in a lot of these discussions is the hugely important context. So um, I hope that I've connected some of these issues together for some people. Again, I'm not an economist, do not know um, the the exact relationships between some of these things, but I'm just sharing what I do know and my impressions as a mathematician, which is that that does not do what it says that it does. It is very interesting though, and I'm really interested to see what exactly gets done with this in the coming weeks here. So let me know what you think, and yeah, this was fun.